Hello there, and welcome to Simple Sleepy Science. Take a moment to ponder. What does it mean for something to disappear forever? Not just to leave the room or move away, but to vanish so completely that the universe itself forgets the shape of you. Tonight, as you settle into comfort and let your breathing slow, consider this. Extinction isn't an ending. It's a transformation into memory, into wonder, into the stories we tell in the quiet hours before sleep finds us. Tonight, we're going to meet some of these vanished beings. Not to mourn them, though there's room for sadness here, but to understand them, to let their stories wash over us like warm water, carrying us gently towards sleep while filling our minds with wonder instead of worry. Because there's something deeply peaceful about deep time, about understanding that everything, even mountains, even oceans, even entire species, has its moment and then transforms into something else. If you enjoy falling asleep to stories that expand your mind while calming your thoughts, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's journey into the mysteries of our world. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing you're out there, somewhere under the same stars. There were creatures on this planet who lived in ways we can barely imagine. Animals so strange, so perfectly adapted to their worlds that they seem like fever dreams or myths. But they were real. They breathed the same air, drank from the same oceans, walked under the same moon that watches over you right now as you lie here in the darkness. These extinct animals weren't failures. That's the lie we've been told, the story that makes extinction sound like some kind of cosmic judgment. But the truth is softer than that, more forgiving. These creatures thrived for thousands, sometimes millions of years. They raised families, they found food, they survived ice ages and droughts and volcanic winters that would have destroyed us in weeks. They were successful beyond measure. And then, like everything that has ever lived, their time simply ended. We live in a universe where nothing is truly lost. Energy cannot be destroyed, only changed. The atoms that once formed a woolly mammoth's tusks are still here, rearranged into new patterns, new lives. The carbon that built a dodo's wings now feeds trees or floats in clouds, or perhaps even moves through your own breath as you inhale slowly, deeply, letting go of the day's tension. These extinct animals left us gifts. They left us their bones, which tell stories written in calcium and time. They left us their shapes, pressed into stone like love letters to the future. They left us questions that science is still trying to answer, mysteries that keep paleontologists awake at night with excitement while helping the rest of us drift towards sleep with wonder. So, let's begin this journey together, you and I, traveling backward through time to meet the gentle giants, the quiet wanderers, the creatures who once walked beside us in this strange and beautiful experiment we call life on Earth. The first creature we'll meet tonight lived in the cold waters off the coast of Siberia. The Steller's sea cow was massive. Imagine an animal longer than a bus, weighing as much as 3 cars, drifting through forests of kelp like a living submarine. They were gentle beyond measure, moving so slowly through the water that seaweed would grow on their backs. These animals spent their entire lives eating, not frantically, not desperately, but with a kind of peaceful dedication that feels almost meditative. They would graze on kelp for up to 18 hours a day, their huge bodies bobbing at the surface while they munched on the underwater plants. Their mouths had no teeth, just hard pads that crushed and ground the kelp into something they could swallow. Imagine spending 3/4 of your day just slowly, peacefully eating, floating in cold water while the world moved around you. The sea cows had thick, wrinkled skin that looked almost like tree bark, dark and rough, covered in scars and marks from a lifetime of brushing against rocks and ice. But underneath that tough exterior was a layer of fat nearly a foot thick. This blubber kept them warm in waters that would freeze a human in minutes. It also made them incredibly buoyant. They couldn't dive, even if they wanted to. They were prisoners of the surface, bobbing like enormous corks, faces always turned toward the sky. They lived in family groups. When hunters killed one sea cow, the others would gather around it, trying to help, trying to pull their dying family member to safety. They showed grief. They showed loyalty. They stayed with their dead instead of fleeing, which is perhaps the most heartbreaking thing about their gentle nature. In a world that was about to become very dangerous for them, they had evolved to be trusting, to be slow, to be unafraid. Georg Wilhelm Steller discovered them in 1741 when his ship wrecked on the Commander Islands. He was a naturalist, and he documented these creatures with wonder and precision. He watched them eat. He observed their family bonds. He measured their enormous bodies and noted how their tails, unlike other marine mammals, looked almost like a whale's flukes, but moved side to side instead of up and down. He wrote about their peaceful existence, never imagining he was watching the beginning of their end. For thousands of years before Steller arrived, these animals had lived safely in the cold North Pacific. They had survived ice ages and warming periods. They had found their perfect life, grazing in shallow bays where killer whales couldn't reach them, and food grew endlessly. Evolution had shaped them into creatures of pure, peaceful existence. No predators to fear, no competition for food, just endless days of floating and eating and being together. But their meat was delicious. Their fat could be rendered into oil that burned cleanly. Their hide made useful leather. Within 27 years of being discovered by humans, every single Steller's sea cow was dead. The last one was killed in 1768. They went from thriving to extinct in less than 3 decades, faster than almost any large animal in recorded history. There's something we need to understand about the Steller's sea cow. Their gentleness wasn't a weakness in the world they evolved in. It was perfect intelligence. In the cold, quiet waters of the North Pacific, where no predators hunted them and kelp grew thick as forests, being slow and trusting was the smart choice. Why waste energy fleeing when there's nothing to flee from? Why be aggressive when cooperation keeps everyone alive? Their metabolism was incredibly slow. They burned calories at a rate that would make a sloth look hyperactive. This meant they could survive on simple kelp, plants that other animals couldn't get enough nutrition from. While seals and sea lions needed to hunt fish, burning massive amounts of energy to chase fast-moving prey, sea cows just floated and chewed. Less effort, less risk, more time for family and rest. Think about how they raised their young. A mother sea cow would keep her calf close for over a year, nursing it, teaching it which kelp beds were safest, showing it how to use the tides to move between feeding grounds without wasting energy. The calf would follow her like a shadow, learning the slow wisdom that had kept their species alive for millions of years. Patience, stillness, trust in the abundance around you. Their blubber wasn't just insulation. It was a storage system for times when kelp might be scarce, though in their world, those times rarely came. They had engineered themselves into a life of such efficiency that they needed almost nothing. No speed, no weapons, no fear. Just the ability to float, to eat, and to be together. But here's the thing about being perfectly adapted to one specific world. When that world changes, perfection becomes prison. The sea cows had traded away every defense for the luxury of peace. They couldn't dive to escape. They couldn't swim fast to flee. They had no teeth to bite with, no aggression to fight back with. They had spent millions of years becoming the most peaceful creatures in their ecosystem, and when violent creatures arrived, they had nothing to defend themselves with except their family bonds. And those bonds, beautiful as they were, made them easier to kill. Hunters learned quickly that if you wounded one sea cow, the others would come to help. They would surround their injured family member, making themselves perfect targets. The very thing that made them successful in their peaceful world made them vulnerable in the new world humans brought with them. Their slow metabolism meant they couldn't flee to new waters, couldn't adapt quickly to change. They needed those specific kelp forests in those specific cold, shallow bays. Move them somewhere else, and they would starve before their bodies could adjust. Evolution had painted them into a corner of perfect specialization. There's a lesson in this for falling asleep. Sometimes the things we think make us vulnerable are actually what kept us safe all along. The sea cow's slowness wasn't stupidity. It was the wisdom of millions of years. They lived in a paradise where being gentle was being smart, where trust was survival, where moving through life at a peaceful pace meant thriving. They couldn't have known the world would shift so violently beneath them. None of us ever do. Let's shift now from the ocean to the sky, to a bird so common that people thought it would last forever. The passenger pigeon didn't live in small flocks. They moved across North America in numbers that sound made up, like someone exaggerating a fish story. But the records are clear, the witnesses consistent. There were billions of them. When a flock passed overhead, the sky would go dark. Not dim dark. The sun would disappear behind a living river of wings that stretched from horizon to horizon. The sound wasn't chirping or singing. It was a roar, like standing next to a waterfall or a freight train. The beating of wings created wind strong enough to blow hats off heads. People would stop whatever they were doing and just stare upward at this impossible thing, this breathing blanket that covered the entire sky. A single flock could take hours to pass, sometimes days. In 1866, a flock flew over Ontario that was described as being 1 mile wide and 3 miles long. Think about that. 300 miles of birds packed so tightly that their wings touched. Scientists estimate that flock alone contained over 3 billion birds. 3 billion individuals, all moving as one, flowing across the continent like a single massive organism. They nested together too. Entire forests would fill with passenger pigeons, every tree holding dozens of nests, branches breaking under the weight of birds and eggs, and desperate parents feeding their young. The ground beneath these nesting colonies would be covered in droppings several inches deep, killing the plants, turning the forest floor into something between mud and paste. The smell must have been overwhelming, but to the pigeons, this was safety. This was home. Here's what's fascinating about living in groups that large. No predator could touch them. Hawks and falcons would try, but what's one predator against a billion birds? The math didn't work. A fox might grab a few birds from the ground. An owl might snatch one from a branch. But these losses were invisible against the vast numbers. The flock was its own fortress, protection through sheer overwhelming presence. They moved together with a precision that scientists still don't fully understand. How does a flock that large coordinate? How do billions of individual birds decide to turn at the same moment, banking and flowing like water? There was no leader, no signal that we could detect. Each bird watched its neighbors, adjusted its flight, and the information rippled through the entire flock faster than thought. They were a hive mind with wings, a collective intelligence that emerged from simple rules followed by millions. Individual passenger pigeons weren't remarkable. They looked like elongated mourning doves, blue-grey with rusty breasts, about as long as your forearm from beak to tail. Males had prettier colours than females, iridescent feathers that caught the light. But one pigeon alone was just a bird. Put them together in numbers that blocked out the sun, and they became something else entirely. They became a force of nature, a migration that shaped ecosystems, a living storm that could eat every nut and berry in a forest and then move on, leaving the trees stripped bare but fertilized by mountains of droppings. The passenger pigeons understood something we've mostly forgotten. Safety isn't found in isolation. It's found in belonging to something so much larger than yourself that you become nearly invisible, protected by the sheer mass of others who share your fate. Each bird in those massive flocks had its own life. It found a mate, built a nest, raised chicks, felt hunger and cold and the joy of flight. But it also knew that survival meant staying with the group. A pigeon alone was easy prey. 10 pigeons together were still vulnerable, but 1 million pigeons moving as one liquid shape across the sky, that was immortality, or as close as nature allows. They communicated through their bodies. When one bird sensed danger and veered away, the birds nearest to it responded instantly, turning without thinking. And that turn rippled outward through the entire flock in waves. It happened so fast that the whole group could change direction in seconds. Thousands of tons of living birds flowing around a threat like water around a stone. No panic, no chaos, just instant, elegant response. The interesting thing is that no single bird understood the whole pattern. Each pigeon only paid attention to the 7 or 8 birds nearest to it. Match their speed, maintain your distance, adjust when they adjust. These simple rules, followed by billions of individuals, created something that looked like intelligence on a massive scale. The flock knew things no individual bird could know. It found food sources across thousands of square miles. It navigated using landmarks none of them had seen before. It made decisions that kept the whole group alive. They also shared information without meaning to. When one bird found food, it would descend. Other birds would notice and follow. More would see those birds descending and join them. Within minutes, thousands of pigeons would converge on a food source that only one bird had discovered. This is how they survived. This is how they stripped entire forests of acorns and beechnuts in days, then moved on to find more. But this system had a breaking point. The pigeons needed vast numbers to make their survival strategy work. They couldn't nest successfully in small groups because predators would overwhelm them. They couldn't migrate safely without the protection of the billion-strong flocks. Their entire way of life depended on having numbers so large that losses didn't matter. When humans started killing them by the millions, the system kept working at first. Millions dead? The flock still had billions. But there's a number, somewhere in the mathematics of survival, where the strategy fails, where the group becomes small enough that predators matter again, where coordination breaks down because there aren't enough birds to create those flowing, intelligent patterns, where the very thing that made them successful becomes impossible to maintain. The passenger pigeons crossed that invisible line, and once they did, their decline was catastrophic. Not slow, not gradual. Catastrophic, because their survival was all or nothing. Either the flock was large enough to work, or it wasn't. There was no middle ground, no way to survive in small, scattered groups. They had built their entire existence around abundance. And when abundance vanished, so did they. Now we move from creatures of the crowd to an animal that hunted alone. The thylacine, called the Tasmanian tiger because of the stripes across its back, was a predator that looked like nature couldn't decide what to make. It had a dog's body, a kangaroo's tail, and stripes like a tiger. But it wasn't related to any of these animals. It was a marsupial, carrying its young in a pouch, the largest carnivorous marsupial to survive into modern times. They hunted at dusk and dawn, those in-between times when the light plays tricks and shadows stretch long. Their jaws could open wider than seems possible, nearly 90 degrees, creating a gape that looked almost snake-like. When they yawned, which they did when stressed, it was unsettling to watch. This huge mouth opening in what looked like a threat display, but was actually just the animal's way of showing anxiety. Thylacines moved with a strange, stiff gait. Their back legs were shorter than their front legs, giving them an odd, sloping posture. They couldn't run fast for long distances, but they didn't need to. They hunted through persistence, following prey for hours, never giving up, wearing the animal down through sheer stubborn endurance. They would track wallabies and small kangaroos through the Tasmanian bush, patient and methodical, until their prey was too exhausted to escape. Their stripes were beautiful, dark bands that ran from the middle of their back down to the base of their tail, 13 to 19 of them, depending on the individual. In certain light, the stripes seemed to shimmer, making the animal look ghostly, not quite real. People who saw them in the wild often described them as dreamlike, as if They weren't sure they'd actually seen what they thought they'd seen. They were shy, unlike wolves or big cats that might stand their ground or even approach humans with curiosity. Thylacines fled. They wanted nothing to do with people. In zoos, they would pace anxiously, never relaxing, always aware of being watched. The stress of captivity was visible in their behavior. Constant yawning, pacing the same path over and over, refusing to breed. The last known thylacine died in 1936 at the Hobart Zoo in Tasmania. His name was Benjamin, though we're not entirely sure he was male. The records are confused. What we do know is that he died alone, locked out of his shelter on a cold night. The zookeepers forgot to let him into the protected sleeping area, and he died of exposure, the last of his kind, dying because someone forgot to open a door. There's footage of him, about 1 minute of black and white film, showing Benjamin pacing in his concrete enclosure, yawning that huge, disturbing yawn, looking at the camera with an expression that's hard to read. Is it fear? Resignation? We project so much onto that footage because it's all we have left. 1 minute of grainy film and some photographs, and that's the only proof we have of how these animals moved and breathed and existed in space. The video doesn't show a fierce predator. It shows a stressed, confused animal trapped in a place it doesn't understand, displaying the only behaviors it has left. Imagine being the last, not the last person in a room or the last one awake in your house. The last of your entire kind on the entire planet. Every thylacine that ever existed, every striped hunter that ever tracked prey through Tasmanian forests, every individual that ever yawned that distinctive yawn, it all comes down to you. And then you die on a cold night because someone forgot to open a door. Benjamin didn't know he was the last. He couldn't have understood that concept, but he knew he was alone. Thylacines were solitary hunters, yes, but they still encountered each other. They still mated, still raised young, still crossed paths in the bush, and acknowledged each other's presence before moving on. Benjamin had none of that. He had concrete and bars, and the stares of people who saw him as a curiosity, a leftover from a world that was already gone. There's something deeply wrong about a species ending with a single individual locked in a cage. It should end in the wild, if it has to end at all. The last thylacine should have been hunting at dusk, moving through familiar territory, living the life its ancestors lived for thousands of years. Instead, Benjamin paced in circles, yawned from stress, and froze to death because humans couldn't even care for the last one properly. The moment he died, something left the universe forever. Not just his individual consciousness, but every possibility his species held. Thylacines had survived for millions of years, had weathered climate changes and ice ages, and the arrival of humans to Australia. They were resilient, adaptable in their own way. But resilience has limits, and human hunting exceeded those limits faster than evolution could respond. We have to sit with that, the permanence of it. Benjamin died in 1936, and in the decades since, there have been reported sightings in Tasmania. People claim they've seen thylacines in remote areas, moving through shadows, glimpsed briefly before vanishing. These reports keep coming. There have been searches, camera traps set up in promising locations, expeditions into the wilderness. Nothing, no proof, just hope dressed up as sightings, the human inability to accept that something is truly gone. Part of us refuses to believe extinction is real. Surely somewhere, in some hidden valley or unexplored forest, a small population survives. We want the story to have a different ending. We want Benjamin to not have been the last, for his death to not have been the final period at the end of a very long sentence. But wanting doesn't change reality. The thylacine is gone. That's the truth we have to carry. And here's what makes it peaceful in a strange way. Benjamin's suffering ended. He's not pacing anymore, not yawning from stress, not living in confusion and captivity. Whatever awareness he had, whatever capacity for suffering, it's over. The species is gone, but the pain is gone too. This is the thing about extinction that sleep teaches us. Endings are real. Things disappear. Species vanish. Stars burn out. Even mountains eventually erode to nothing. The universe is full of things that once were and no longer are. And somehow, life continues. The world kept spinning after Benjamin died. Tasmania's forests still grow. Other animals fill the niches thylacines left empty. Let's travel further back now, to creatures so slow they make the Stella's sea cow look energetic. Giant ground sloths roamed the Americas for millions of years. Some species growing as tall as elephants, weighing several tons, moving through ancient forests at a pace that would test anyone's patience. They were vegetarians with claws the length of your forearm. Not for hunting, those claws, for reaching. A ground sloth would stand on its hind legs, using its massive tail as a third point of support, and reach up into trees to pull branches down to its mouth. They could stand like this for hours, slowly stripping leaves, chewing with their flat teeth, digesting plant matter that most animals couldn't process. Their metabolism was incredibly slow, slower than almost any mammal alive today. They didn't need much food relative to their size, because they burned so few calories. While a lion has to eat constantly to fuel its explosive hunting, ground sloths could go days between meals. They conserved energy the way misers conserve money, spending it only when absolutely necessary. This slowness was their strategy for survival. Predators like saber-toothed cats existed in their world, huge dangerous carnivores with teeth like daggers. But attacking a giant ground sloth was risky business. Those claws that reached for branches could also slash and tear. The thick hide was tough to penetrate, and the sloth's slow movements made it unpredictable. Fast prey runs in predictable patterns. Slow prey just exists. Steady, immovable, dangerous if cornered. They had thick bones, denser than most mammals, which made them heavy but also incredibly strong. A ground sloth skeleton looks like it was built to last, like nature was expecting these animals to carry weight and stress that would break other creatures. And they did last. Ground sloths existed for roughly 35 million years across various species. That's longer than humans, and our direct ancestors have existed by a factor of 10. Picture one standing in an ancient forest. It's early morning, mist hanging between the trees, and this enormous creature is perfectly still, barely breathing, conserving energy. After a while, so slowly you might not notice at first, it reaches up toward a branch. The movement takes minutes. The claws hook around bark. The branch bends. The sloth pulls it to its mouth and begins to chew. This single action, from reaching to swallowing, might take half an hour. There's something deeply peaceful about imagining life at that pace. No rushing, no anxiety about what comes next. Just the immediate moment, stretched out and made large. Eat when hungry, which isn't often. Rest when tired, which is most of the time. Move when necessary, but define necessary very narrowly. They didn't live in groups like the passenger pigeons. They were solitary, crossing paths occasionally to mate, mothers raising young for a time before the offspring wandered off to find their own territories. But it wasn't the anxious solitude of the Thylacine. It was peaceful solitude, the contentment of an animal that needs very little and has millions of years of evolution, proving that this approach works. Ground sloths survived the ice ages. They watched the climate swing from warm to cold and back again. They outlasted countless other species. What finally ended them wasn't climate change or natural disaster. What killed the ground sloths was the arrival of humans. Fast, clever hunters who could coordinate attacks, who had weapons that made up for their smaller size, who could think and plan and work together to bring down prey much larger than themselves. The sloths had no defense against this kind of intelligence. Their slowness, which had protected them for millions of years, became their downfall. But before we get to their ending, let's stay with what they mastered: the art of slowness. In our world, everything pushes us to move faster. Answer emails immediately. Make quick decisions. Keep up or fall behind. The ground sloths lived by the opposite philosophy. Why hurry when hurrying burns energy you don't need to spend? Why rush toward the future when the present moment has everything you need? Their digestion was famously slow. Food could take a month to pass completely through their system. A month. They had multi-chambered stomachs like cows, breaking down tough plant material bit by bit, extracting every possible nutrient. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. This is how they survived on relatively little food. They processed it so thoroughly that they got more nutrition from a single meal than faster animals could. Sleep came easily to them. They would rest for 15 to 20 hours a day, their massive bodies still, their breathing slow and deep. During this rest, their body temperature would drop, conserving even more energy. They were masters of doing nothing, and doing nothing kept them alive across millions of years of changing climates and ecosystems. There's wisdom here for us, trying to fall asleep in our fast-paced world. The ground sloth didn't fight against its nature. It didn't try to be faster, or more aggressive, or more competitive. It found a way of living that worked and stuck with it for an incomprehensible amount of time. 35 million years. Humans have existed for maybe 300,000 years as a species. Ground sloths outlasted us by a factor of more than 100. They also had something else we could learn from: contentment. A ground sloth didn't seem to want anything beyond what it had: food, safety, enough territory to browse in peace. There's no evidence they felt dissatisfaction or restlessness. They weren't building or creating or trying to change their world. They were just being, fully and completely, exactly what they were meant to be. Modern sloths, the smaller tree-dwelling ones that still exist, carry echoes of this ancient wisdom. They move so slowly, that algae grows in their fur, turning them green and helping them blend into the trees. They descend from the canopy only once a week to defecate, a journey that puts them at risk from predators, but which they make anyway, slowly and methodically, because this is what their bodies require. The giant ground sloths are gone now. The last ones died roughly 10,000 years ago. Around the same time, humans were spreading across the Americas, learning to farm, building the first permanent settlements. The world was speeding up, and there was no place anymore for creatures that moved through life at a pace measured in hours per action. But they left us their bones, huge skeletons that show up in caves and tar pits, teaching us that success isn't always about being the fastest, or the strongest, or the smartest. Sometimes, success means being perfectly adapted to a world that never changes. And sometimes, that same perfection destroys you the moment change arrives. The dodo understood this lesson better than almost any creature. We use dumb as a dodo as an insult, but this completely misses the truth. The dodo wasn't stupid. It was intelligent in exactly the way its environment required. On the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, there were no predators, no mammals hunting birds, no snakes, no big cats, no threats at all in that world. Being fearless wasn't foolish. It was efficient. The dodo was a large bird, about 3 feet tall, weighing around 50 pounds. It had tiny wings that couldn't lift its heavy body, a distinctive hooked beak, and legs that carried it through the forest with surprising speed when it needed to move. It ate fruits and seeds, nested on the ground, and raised one chick at a time with careful attention. Flight costs energy. Building flight muscles, maintaining them, developing hollow bones and powerful wings, all of this requires resources. The dodo's ancestors could fly. They arrived on Mauritius millions of years ago, probably blown off course during a storm. But once there, they found paradise. Abundant food, perfect climate, 0 predators. So, over generations, flight became unnecessary. Why waste energy maintaining wings when walking works perfectly well? This is brilliant adaptation, not stupidity. The dodo allocated its resources to things that mattered in its world. Better digestion for processing tough fruits, stronger legs for moving through dense forest, a larger body that could store fat for times when food was scarce. It optimized itself for the life it actually lived, not for threats that didn't exist. The dodo was also trusting. When Dutch sailors arrived in 1598, the birds apparently walked right up to them, curious, unafraid. The sailors could kill them with sticks. This behavior gets labeled as dumb, but again, this misses the point. In the dodo's world, which had existed unchanged for millions of years, curiosity was safe. Approaching new things to investigate them was normal behavior. Nothing had ever punished this openness. Imagine living in a world where nothing ever hurt you, where every interaction was neutral or positive, where investigating the unfamiliar led to finding new food sources or interesting experiences. In that world, you would be trusting too. Fearlessness would be the smart strategy. The dodo nested on the ground in simple scrapes, laying a single large egg. Both parents cared for the chick, which took months to mature. This slow reproduction rate worked fine. When there were no predators to raid nests, Every egg had time to hatch. Every chick had time to grow. The species maintained stable numbers for millennia without needing to produce offspring rapidly. They had a call that sailors described as sounding like a goose, a honking noise that echoed through the forests. They used it to communicate with mates, to signal alarm, though alarm in their world meant maybe a storm coming or a tree falling, nothing that required immediate fleeing. Their digestive system could process extremely hard fruits that other animals couldn't eat. Some trees on Mauritius evolved seeds that needed to pass through a dodo's gut to germinate properly. Mauritius was a world unto itself. Volcanic in origin, it rose from the Indian Ocean roughly 8 million years ago, a green jewel of forests and mountains surrounded by coral reefs and turquoise water. By the time the dodo's ancestors arrived, the island had developed into something rare and precious, a complete ecosystem with no large predators. The forests were dense with ebony trees and palms, fruit-bearing plants that produced food year-round. The climate was stable, warm, but not too hot, with enough rain to keep everything green and growing. There were other birds, lizards, insects, but nothing that hunted the dodo. The largest threats were cyclones that would occasionally sweep across the island, powerful storms that the birds learned to weather by finding shelter and waiting out the wind. In this paradise, evolution took interesting paths. Several bird species lost their ability to fly. Not just the dodo, but also rails and parrots that found walking more useful than flying. There were giant tortoises that could live for over 100 years, moving slowly through the undergrowth, eating fallen fruits. There were fruit bats that pollinated flowers at night, creating a rhythm of life that cycled between day and night species without conflict. The dodo fit into this system perfectly. It ate fruits that fell from trees, dispersing seeds throughout the forest. Some plants evolved to produce fruits specifically sized for the dodo's beak, creating a partnership where the tree got seed dispersal and the bird got food. This relationship had developed over millions of years, each species shaping the other. The island had no winter, no dry season harsh enough to threaten food supplies. The dodo didn't need to migrate or hibernate. It could stay in familiar territory year-round, learning every fruit tree, every water source, every safe place to nest. This stability meant the birds could develop complex knowledge of their home range, passing information from parents to offspring about where the best food grew and when different fruits ripened. There were no large mammals, no monkeys to raid nests, no rodents to eat eggs, no ground predators of any kind. The dodo nested directly on the forest floor, sometimes just creating a small platform of vegetation to keep the egg off the damp ground. The chick would hatch after several weeks, covered in grey down, and both parents would bring it food until it could walk and forage on its own. Life moved at a gentle pace. The dodo didn't need to be constantly vigilant. It could spend hours just resting in the shade, digesting tough fruits, conserving energy. Young birds could take their time learning to find food, protected by parents who weren't stressed by constant threats. The population stayed balanced naturally, with enough birds to maintain genetic diversity, but not so many that they stripped the forest of resources. This paradise had one vulnerability built into its very foundation. It was an island, isolated. Everything that lived there had evolved in isolation, without exposure to the predators and diseases and competitive pressures of mainland ecosystems. The dodo had never met a rat, never encountered a pig or a monkey, never had to defend against humans. When ships finally arrived, bringing all of these things at once, the island's creatures had no reference point, no inherited behaviors to help them respond. From an island paradise, we move to the cold forests and grasslands of Ice Age Europe and Asia, where an animal carried the largest antlers ever grown by any deer species. The Irish elk wasn't actually an elk, and it didn't live only in Ireland, but names stick even when they're wrong. What matters is the antlers, 12 feet across in the largest specimens, weighing up to 90 pounds, growing fresh every single year. Think about what this means. Every spring, a male Irish elk would shed his antlers. The enormous rack that had defined his appearance for months would simply fall off, leaving him bareheaded and vulnerable. Then, immediately, his body would begin growing replacements. This process consumed massive amounts of calcium and energy. The growing antlers were covered in velvet, soft tissue filled with blood vessels that fed the developing bone underneath. For months, the elk would carry these growing antlers carefully, avoiding damage to the velvet that would compromise their development. When fully grown, he would rub the velvet off against trees, revealing the polished bone underneath. And then he'd carry this weight, this elaborate crown, through his daily life. Walking through forests meant navigating between trees without catching the antlers on branches. Drinking from streams required careful positioning to avoid throwing himself off balance. The antlers weren't just decoration, they were weapons and signals. Males would face each other during mating season, antlers locked, pushing and wrestling to prove dominance. The largest antlers usually won, not just because of the physical advantage, but because they signaled genetic quality. Growing antlers that size required being healthy, well-fed, and strong. Females could look at a male's antlers and know immediately whether he was worth mating with. But here's the thing about traits that evolve through sexual selection. They can become excessive. Once females start preferring males with larger antlers, evolution pushes the trait in one direction only. Bigger becomes better, even when bigger starts to become a burden. The Irish elk's antlers may have crossed the line from advantage to liability, though scientists still debate this. Imagine carrying 90 pounds on your head. Your neck muscles would need to be enormous just to hold it up. Your diet would need to be rich in calcium and minerals to replace what gets locked into antler growth every year. You'd need access to abundant, high-quality food throughout the growing season, because if nutrition faltered while the antlers were developing, they'd grow deformed or weak. The Irish elk lived during a time when climate was changing rapidly. The Ice Age was ending, warming. Periods alternated with cold snaps, and the landscape shifted from open grasslands to dense forests. Open grassland was perfect for an animal with 12-foot antlers. Dense forest was a nightmare. Every tree became an obstacle, every thicket a trap. These animals were massive beyond their antlers too. They stood 7 feet tall at the shoulder, larger than modern moose. They had thick, powerful bodies adapted for cold climates, with coats that could insulate against harsh winters. They lived in herds, browsing on grasses and low shrubs, migrating seasonally to follow food sources and avoid the worst weather. Males carried their antlers with a kind of dignity you can see in the skeletons and cave paintings left behind. There's a point where beauty becomes burden, where the thing that made you successful starts to work against you. The Irish elk's antlers tell this story perfectly. For thousands of generations, larger antlers meant more mates, which meant passing on the genes for large antlers, which meant the next generation grew them even bigger. It was a feedback loop that couldn't stop itself. The problem with runaway sexual selection is that it doesn't care about practicality. Evolution through mate choice operates on different logic than evolution through survival pressure. A peacock's tail makes flying harder and attracts predators, but it also attracts mates, so the genes for elaborate tails persist. The Irish elk faced the same trap, but with antlers that weighed as much as a small person. When climate changed and forests grew denser, these antlers became lethal disadvantages. A male elk running from wolves might catch his antlers on low branches and get stuck. Imagine the terror of that moment. Predators closing in while you're tangled in your own display of genetic fitness. The very thing that won you mates could get you killed before you had the chance to mate again. The energy cost was staggering. Growing those antlers required consuming massive amounts of calcium, phosphorus, and protein every spring and summer. If food was scarce, the elk's body would pull minerals from its own skeleton to complete antler growth, weakening bones and leaving the animal vulnerable. Males in poor condition might grow smaller, misshapen antlers, which meant failing to attract mates, which meant genetic death even if they survived physically. Females didn't carry this burden. They had no antlers at all, just smooth heads and bodies optimized for survival rather than display. This meant they could put all their energy into staying healthy and raising calves. The males paid the biological cost of sexual selection, while females reaped the benefits of choosing mates with good genes without carrying the expensive advertisements themselves. Some scientists think the antlers didn't directly cause extinction, but were symptoms of a deeper problem. A species that invests that much energy into ornamental features is a species living on the edge. When environmental conditions tightened, when food became harder to find and climate grew more unstable, the Irish elk didn't have any buffer. They were already spending maximum energy just maintaining their breeding displays. Contrast this with deer species that survived. They had smaller antlers, less elaborate, easier to grow and carry. When times got tough, they could reduce antler size without losing the ability to compete for mates. They had flexibility built into their biology. The Irish elk had committed fully to one strategy and lost the ability to adapt. This teaches us something about our own defining traits. The things that make us special, that we build our identity around, can become prisons if we're not careful. Over-specialization works beautifully in stable conditions, but fails catastrophically when change comes. The Irish elk was magnificent, truly one of the most impressive deer that ever lived. But magnificence doesn't guarantee survival. By about 7,700 years ago, they were gone. Not suddenly, but through a gradual decline as their habitat changed, and the costs of those antlers outweighed the benefits. The last populations held on in Siberia, where open grasslands persisted longest, before finally disappearing into the past. Now we meet perhaps the most famous extinct animal, the icon of the Ice Age itself, the woolly mammoth. These creatures survived in places so cold that exposed skin would freeze in minutes, where winter lasted most of the year and summer was just a brief warm pause before the cold returned. They were smaller than modern elephants, but perfectly built for extreme cold. A thick layer of fat, sometimes 4 inches deep, wrapped their bodies like insulation. Over that, a dense undercoat of fine wool, and covering everything, long guard hairs that could reach 3 feet in length. This double layer of fur trapped air and created a microclimate around their bodies, keeping warmth in and cold out. Their ears were tiny, about a foot long compared to the huge ears of African elephants. Small ears meant less surface area to lose heat through. Same with their tails, short, stubby things barely long enough to swat flies during the brief summer. Every feature was minimized to reduce heat loss. Even their trunks had fur. The tusks curved dramatically, some males carrying tusks that curved so much they nearly touched, creating a spiral shape that archaeologists find beautiful and puzzling. What were these tusks for? Display, certainly, fighting other males during mating season, but also practical work. Mammoths used their tusks to sweep snow away from the dried grasses underneath, exposing food buried under feet of snow. They were living snowplows, using ivory to access nutrition that sustained them through endless winters. They ate constantly during summer, building up fat reserves. Grasses, sedges, flowers, small shrubs, anything green and edible. A single mammoth could consume 400 pounds of vegetation in a day, processing it with specialized teeth that grew in sequence throughout their lives. As one set of grinding teeth wore down from all that plant material, another would move forward to replace it. 6 sets of teeth over a lifetime, the final set arriving around age 40. These animals lived in herds led by the oldest females, just like modern elephants. The matriarch held knowledge about where to find food in different seasons, where water stayed liquid even in deep winter, which paths were safe and which led to danger. This knowledge transferred from generation to generation, creating a cultural memory that helped the herd survive. Young mammoths stayed close to their mothers for years, learning everything they needed to know about surviving in one of Earth's harshest environments. When a mammoth died, the herd would sometimes stay with the body, touching it with their trunks, showing behavior that looked remarkably like grief. We find fossils of multiple mammoths together, suggesting they didn't abandon their dead, that they felt loss in ways we can recognize. They survived multiple ice ages. Climate would swing from cold to colder and back to merely cold, and the mammoths adapted, moved, persisted. When warmth came briefly, they moved north, following the tundra as it migrated toward the pole. When cold returned, they moved south again. They were nomads on a continental scale, following the specific ecosystem they needed across thousands of miles. Their thick skin was dark, helping absorb what little sunlight penetrated the long Arctic winters. Combined with the fur, this created an animal that could maintain body temperature in conditions that would kill most mammals within hours. The mammoths' adaptations were so thorough that cold wasn't just something they survived. It was their comfort zone. They were built for it, the way fish are built for water. Take a mammoth to a warm climate and it would overheat, that thick fur becoming a deadly liability. But in the Arctic tundra, they were home. Their blood had special hemoglobin that worked efficiently even when body temperature dropped. This meant they could allow their extremities to cool slightly without damaging tissue, conserving the energy it would take to keep every part of their body at maximum warmth. Their feet had thick, fatty pads that insulated them from frozen ground, letting them walk across ice and snow without losing heat through contact. They even had a flap of skin that could cover their anus, protecting it from frostbite. This level of detail in cold adaptation shows how completely evolution can solve a problem when given enough time. Millions of years of mammoths living in cold climates and natural selection refined every possible vulnerability. Social bonds helped too. Herds would huddle together during the worst storms, the largest adults forming a protective ring around the young. Body heat shared between individuals meant less energy spent per mammoth to stay warm. The calves would stay pressed against their mothers, sheltered by the curve of her body, warmed by her bulk. Survival wasn't just about individual toughness, but about cooperation and care. Their fat wasn't just insulation, it was a battery, stored energy that could sustain them when food became scarce. During the hardest part of winter, when snow covered everything and finding food meant hours of work sweeping with tusks and digging with trunks, mammoths could rely on their fat reserves to keep going. This is how they survived multiple seasons where a less adapted animal would starve. They also had excellent memory, a trait inherited by their elephant relatives. A matriarch who lived to be 60 or 70 years old would remember water sources that only flowed in specific conditions, migration routes that avoided the worst terrain, places where food could be found even in desperate times. This knowledge was survival, passed down through generations, not as instinct, but as learned behavior, mother to daughter to granddaughter. Their trunk was remarkably sensitive despite the cold. They could manipulate small objects, communicate through touch, smell predators from miles away. The trunk had to work in temperatures far below freezing without losing flexibility, which required special tissue that stayed supple even when everything else was frozen. They used it to dust themselves with dirt in summer, to prevent sunburn and insect bites, to show affection by intertwining trunks with family members, to comfort distressed young by laying it gently across their backs. Woolly mammoths thrived for hundreds of thousands of years. They spread across the northern hemisphere, from Europe to Asia to North America, following the ice and the grasslands it created. They saw the rise and fall of countless other species. They survived volcanic eruptions and asteroid impacts, and every climate fluctuation the Pleistocene could throw at them. What they couldn't survive was the double pressure of rapid warming at the end of the last ice age, combined with intensive hunting by human populations that had developed sophisticated weapons and coordinated hunting strategies. From the tundra to the ocean, we meet another creature that thrived in the cold north. The great auk looked like a penguin, but wasn't related to penguins at all. This was convergent evolution, two unrelated birds developing the same body plan because it works so perfectly for a certain way of life. Black and white plumage, upright posture, wings modified into flippers, completely at home in freezing water. Great auks were the penguins of the northern hemisphere. They nested on rocky islands in the North Atlantic, from Canada to Scotland to Iceland. On land, they were clumsy, waddling on short legs, vulnerable to anything that could catch them. But in the water, they transformed into grace itself. Those wings that couldn't lift them into the air became powerful underwater propulsion, letting them dive deep and swim fast, chasing fish with precision and speed. They could dive over 250 feet deep, holding their breath for several minutes while hunting. Down in the cold darkness, where sunlight barely penetrated, they would chase cod and caplin, herring and other schooling fish, using their sharp beaks to grab prey. Their bones were solid, not hollow like flying birds, which gave them the density to dive without fighting against buoyancy. They spent most of their lives at sea, only coming to land to breed. Once a year, they would return to the same rocky islands, finding the same mate if possible, and together they would lay a single egg. Just one. The egg was large relative to the bird's size, covered in spots and swirls of brown and black that made it blend in with the rocky ground. No nest, just bare rock, chosen for being far enough from the water that waves couldn't reach, but close enough that the trip to and from fishing wasn't exhausting. Both parents took turns incubating the egg, balancing it on their feet like emperor penguins do. The parent not sitting on the egg would swim out to feed, sometimes traveling miles to find good fishing, then return to trade places. This partnership lasted until the chick hatched and grew large enough to enter the water, which took about 2 months of constant care and feeding. The chicks were covered in dark, fluffy down, and they grew rapidly on a diet of fish brought back by their parents. When they were ready, still not fully grown, the parents would lead them to the water's edge. The chick would take its first swim, immediately more comfortable in the ocean than it ever was on land. And from that point on, it was a seabird, returning to land only to breed when it reached maturity years later. Great auks were social, nesting in colonies that could hold thousands of pairs. The noise must have been tremendous. Thousands of birds calling to their mates, chicks begging for food, the constant movement and activity of a thriving seabird colony. The smell too, the accumulated droppings and rotting fish, would have been overwhelming to human noses, but perfectly normal to the birds. They had few natural predators. Polar bears might catch them on land, and killer whales could hunt them in the water. But these threats were rare enough that the colonies thrived. The real safety came from choosing islands that were difficult to access, surrounded by rough seas, rocky and inhospitable to most large predators. The great auk's perfection was also its death sentence. They had given up flight completely, which made them extraordinary swimmers, but helpless on land. This trade-off worked beautifully for millions of years. Then, humans discovered their nesting islands, and everything changed in the span of a few centuries. Flightless birds on isolated islands survive, because those islands are hard to reach. The great auk chose nesting sites surrounded by dangerous waters, rocky coasts where landing a boat required skill and courage. This kept them safe from casual threats, but it couldn't keep out determined humans who saw profit in killing them. The birds were easy to catch on land. They couldn't fly away or even run particularly fast. A person could walk up to a great auk and club it to death without much effort. Their fearlessness, which served them well when the only visitors to their islands were occasional polar bears, became a fatal flaw when humans arrived in numbers. Sailors killed them for food. The birds were large, about 30 inches tall and weighing around 11 pounds. Enough meat to be worth the effort. Their eggs were collected by the thousands, large and nutritious, easy to find on the bare rock where the ox laid them. But the worst use was for their feathers and fat. Great auks were killed to stuff mattresses, to render into oil for lamps, to supply the feather trade that made pillows and bedding. The killing was industrial in scale. Entire ships would visit nesting colonies during breeding season and take every bird they could catch, every egg they could find. The auks, unable to flee, unable to defend themselves, could only waddle away slowly while hunters pursued them across the rocks. Some were herded into holding pens to be killed later, held captive on their own nesting islands until they were needed. Their slow reproduction made recovery impossible. 1 egg per year. If that egg was taken or the chick killed, the pair had to wait another full year to try again. Species that lay many eggs can absorb heavy losses and bounce back. The great auk couldn't. Every bird killed, every egg taken, was a permanent loss the population couldn't replace fast enough. The colonies shrank. Islands that once held thousands of breeding pairs saw hundreds, then dozens, then none. The birds couldn't adapt by changing their behavior because their entire life strategy was built around those specific islands and that specific way of living. They couldn't suddenly start nesting in trees or inland areas. They needed rocky coasts near deep cold water with abundant fish, and humans knew exactly where these places were. By the early 1800s, great auks were rare enough to become valuable to collectors. Museums and wealthy individuals would pay high prices for specimens, which created a perverse incentive. The rarer the birds became, the more valuable they were, which encouraged more hunting. The last large colony was raided in 1830. The final confirmed sighting of living great auks was in 1844 on an island off Iceland, where the last breeding pair was killed and their egg destroyed. They were perfectly adapted to a world of rocky islands and fish-filled seas. They couldn't adapt to a world that included humans with boats and clubs and an endless appetite for resources. Let's leave the cold waters and rocky islands for something completely different. The Caribbean monk seal lived in paradise. Warm turquoise waters, white sand beaches, endless sunshine. These seals basked on tropical shores, where the only challenge was finding shade during the hottest part of the day. They were the only seal species native to the Caribbean, perfectly adapted to warm water hunting. Brown or grey in colour, about 8 feet long and weighing up to 600 pounds, they had sleek bodies built for swimming in clear tropical seas. Unlike their Arctic cousins, who needed thick blubber for insulation, Caribbean monk seals were leaner, carrying just enough fat to stay buoyant and store energy without overheating. They hunted at night mostly, diving down to coral reefs to catch fish and octopus. During the day, they would haul out onto beaches and sandbars, lying in the sun or shade, depending on their mood and the temperature. Groups of seals would gather together, social and relaxed, occasionally barking or growling at each other, but mostly just existing peacefully in the warmth. Their hunting strategy was methodical. They would swim along reef edges, checking crevices and holes where fish hid, using their sensitive whiskers to detect movement in murky water or darkness. When they found prey, a quick burst of speed and a snap of the jaws, then back to the surface to breathe and swallow. They could dive for over 15 minutes when necessary, holding their breath while they searched for food in deeper water. Mothers gave birth on beaches, usually to a single pup born in late autumn. The pup would be about 3 feet long at birth, covered in dark fur that would lighten as it grew. The mother would nurse it for several weeks, her milk rich and fatty, to help the pup grow quickly. During this time, she would stay close to the beach, making short hunting trips and returning to feed her pup, protecting it from sharks and the occasional aggressive male seal. The pups learned to swim almost immediately, though they stayed in shallow water at first, playing in the surf, building strength and coordination. By the time they were weaned, they could dive and hunt on their own, though they weren't very good at it yet. Young seals would practice for months, catching small fish and learning the techniques they'd need to survive. These seals had no natural fear of humans. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, his crew reported seeing seals that would barely move when approached, curious rather than afraid. This was the same mistake the dodo made, the same fatal trust that comes from living in a place where nothing has hunted you for thousands of years. The seals were killed for their oil and their hides. Fishermen viewed them as competition for fish and killed them to protect fishing grounds. They were easy targets, hauled out on predictable beaches, unable to escape quickly on land, trusting enough to let people get close. Their populations crashed throughout the 1700s and 1800s. By the 1900s, sightings were rare. A few small groups persisted on remote cays and uninhabited islands. The last confirmed sighting was in 1952 at Serenilla Bank, between Jamaica and Nicaragua. A small group of seals, maybe the last ones left, basking in the sun like their ancestors had done for millennia. After 1952, no one saw them again. The Caribbean monk seal was declared extinct in 2008, though it had almost certainly been gone for decades before that. The warm waters and coral reefs continued without them, but something was missing. Not just the seals themselves, but the role they played in the ecosystem. Every extinct animal leaves a hole. The Stella's sea cow grazed on kelp, keeping it trimmed and healthy, preventing overgrowth that could choke out other marine life. When they disappeared, the kelp forests they tended changed. Not catastrophically, but noticeably the balance shifted. Passenger pigeons fertilized entire forests with their droppings, deposited in massive quantities beneath roosting trees. They dispersed seeds across hundreds of miles, connecting forest ecosystems that might otherwise remain isolated. When they vanished, some tree species that depended on them for seed dispersal struggled. The forests adapted. Other animals filled some of the gaps, but it wasn't the same. Ground sloths shaped the vegetation of Ice Age Americas through their browsing and their dung. Seeds that passed through their digestive systems were scarified and fertilized, ready to sprout. Some plant species may have evolved specifically to be eaten and dispersed by these giant slow browsers. When the sloths disappeared, those plants lost their primary dispersal method. The dodo's extinction affected trees on Mauritius. The Tambalakoke tree, also called the dodo tree, produces seeds with extremely hard shells. Some scientists believe these seeds evolved to be eaten by dodos, whose powerful gizzards would crack the shell just enough to allow germination. Without dodos, the trees struggled to reproduce. This theory is debated, but it illustrates how deeply connected species can become over millions of years. Irish elk fertilized grasslands with their bodies when they died. Their massive carcasses feeding scavengers and returning nutrients to the soil. Their grazing patterns shaped plant communities. Woolly mammoths maintained the grasslands they depended on by trampling shrubs, preventing forests from taking over the tundra. Some scientists think their extinction contributed to the spread of forests in the far north. Great auks transported nutrients from the ocean to their nesting islands. Fish caught at sea became guano on land, fertilizing the sparse vegetation that grew on those rocky shores. Island ecosystems that depended on this nutrient input changed when the auks disappeared. Caribbean monk seals played similar roles, connecting marine and coastal ecosystems through their movements and their waste. But beyond ecological roles, these animals left us something else. Wonder, the knowledge that Earth once held creatures we can barely imagine. Giant sloths as tall as houses, pigeons so numerous they darkened the sky, sea cows larger than cars, floating peacefully in cold northern waters. These facts expand our sense of what's possible, what evolution can create given enough time and the right conditions. Their bones teach us about anatomy and adaptation. Their extinction patterns teach us about vulnerability and resilience. Their stories teach us humility, the understanding that being successful for millions of years doesn't guarantee survival, that change can come faster than evolution can respond. They left us questions too. What did a thylacines call sound like in the wild, not stressed in a zoo? How did it feel to stand beneath a flock of passenger pigeons, so vast it took days to pass? These animals we've met tonight, they're all gone, completely gone in a way that feels impossible to truly grasp. The last Steller's sea cow died in 1768. The last passenger pigeon, a female named Martha, died in a Cincinnati zoo in 1914. The last thylacine died in 1936. The last Caribbean monk seal was seen in 1952. All within the span of human memory, or just beyond it. These aren't ancient mysteries. These are recent losses. But here's what helps as you drift towards sleep. Extinction is part of the pattern. Over 99% of all species that ever lived are now extinct. Billions of species have appeared, thrived, and disappeared over the past 3.5 billion years of life on Earth. The trilobites that dominated oceans for 270 million years are gone. The dinosaurs that ruled for 165 million years are gone, except for their bird descendants. Even the mighty megalodon, the largest shark that ever lived, is gone. Everything that lives will eventually stop living, whether individual or species. This isn't tragedy, it's just the way time works. Stars are born, burn and die. Mountains rise and erode. Species evolve and go extinct. The universe is in constant motion, constant change, and nothing stays the same forever. The atoms that made up a woolly mammoth are still here, just rearranged. The carbon that formed a dodo's feathers is cycling through the ecosystem. Maybe in a tree now, maybe in the ocean, maybe in the body of a bird that lives where dodos once walked. Energy cannot be destroyed, only transformed. Matter cannot be destroyed, only changed. In that sense, nothing is ever truly lost. And we still have their stories. We have bones and fossils and cave paintings and written descriptions. We have DNA extracted from preserved specimens, genetic code that tells us how these animals were related to living species. We have the wonder they inspire, the questions they raise, the way thinking about them expands our sense of time and change and possibility. As you settle deeper into rest, think about this. You are part of the same story, made of the same atoms that cycled through dinosaurs and trilobites, and the first simple cells that ever lived. You're connected to every extinct animal through the basic chemistry of life, through the inheritance of DNA, through the fact that all life on Earth shares a common ancestor somewhere in the deep past. The ground sloths knew something about rest that we're still learning. The sea cows understood peaceful existence. The passenger pigeons lived in connection with millions of their kind. The mammoths survived impossibly harsh conditions through preparation and family bonds. Each extinct animal has something to teach us if we listen quietly enough. So let them go now. Let the extinct animals fade back into deep time as your breathing slows and your mind settles. They lived their lives, played their roles, and when their time ended, they transformed into something else. Memory, fossils, stories that help us fall asleep while learning something beautiful about the world. If these gentle journeys through science bring you peace, please like and subscribe so we can drift together through more amazing stories tomorrow. Sweet dreams, and thank you for exploring the wonder of our world with me tonight. Rest well.